Uses of compression. Now this is where we get into the exciting stuff, where you can use compressors for various things to get all sorts of fun stuff happening. So side chaining, the control of the level out is not controlled by the input or the output. So if you've got yourself an amplifier, and you've got an input and you've got an output, you've got a third input that allows you to control the dynamics of the output of this input signal. So how would we utilize that? Well, we'd utilize that in a lot of different ways. The classic example of using a compressor to control volume is, let's say I'm a talk show host. I'm doing my late night TV show, and I've got a guest. And I know it's going to be a controversial interview. So I tell the engineers, I don't want to be talked over ever. I don't want him to be able to talk louder than me, because we're going to argue over this. So I'm sitting there having my conversation with my guest, and they take his microphone and they put it through a compressor, and they take the side chain input and take it off of my feed, off of my microphone. So every time I speak louder, it reduces his volume. And if you listen to TV and radio, they do that all the time, almost as a matter of practice. So the host is never talked over. You see how that can be useful, right, for broadcast. Now, how can it be useful in our, recording process? Well, here's a great example. I'm sure that everybody that's tried to mix something has had a problem trying to get the kick drum and the bass to work well together, because they're both in the low frequencies, and sometimes you get the bass loud enough and it covers the kick drum up. If the kick's too loud, then the bass is too quiet. It's very difficult to sort of make the bottom feel really working together. So I've done this many times, where I'll take a kick drum and a bass guitar, and I'll put the compressor on the bass, and I'll take the side chain, which is this third input, instead of connecting it to the input or the output, I'll connect it to another track that is my kick drum track. So my kick drum comes along and it triggers the compressor to limit the volume of the output of the bass. So the kick drum happens and my bass level goes dip for just one moment, because I've got a fast attack and a fast release going on. And so it lowers the volume of the bass just for that split second when the kick drum's happening. And then it comes back to normal level after the kick drum's done. That way I can create more sonic space without having to move faders and try to adjust frequencies and all that kind of stuff. It's very, very handy. Very handy. Especially when back in the 90s when I was doing grunge bands, it was like everybody wanted the guitar louder, 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 louder. And then I can't hear the vocal. Oh, push the vocal up. Oh, no, I can't hear the guitars. They're not loud enough. Turn them up. So the louder the vocal got, the smaller the guitars seemed. And they wanted big guitars, so how could I get them both audible, was the big question. I did the same thing. Basically put a compressor across the guitars, and when the vocalist sang, the guitars just slightly came down a dB or two to allow the space for the vocalist to sing. When the vocalist stopped, the guitars pop right back up to bigger than big. And you wouldn't even notice, because your ear would be drawn to the vocal, then the guitars, then the vocal, then the guitars. And basically, I was able to manipulate the space to have enough to make it feel right. It's a pretty cool trick, right? Here's another example. I'm just going to list a few so that you can let your brain sort of go wild with how you can use these things. So in the 80s, we used to do this quite a bit, which was really kind of a cool trick. I think the EDM guys have caught on to it now, but back then we were using it. But what we'd do is we'd take a track and we'd put a pad keyboard in, like a synth pad, maybe strings, maybe an analog, just legato pad that just changed with the chord structure of the song. And we'd put a compressor across it, and we would use the side chain. We'd program a specific kind of a percussion pattern with a drum machine that wasn't even in the song. It was just specifically created to trigger the compressor. And then we'd use congas quite often because they're really good attack and very percussive. And we'd create this percussive track that we would trigger the compressor with and then modulate the pad synthesizer with the conga pattern. So the pad synthesizer then would get louder and quieter based upon where the congas were hitting and not hitting. So it would have this bubbling kind of effect. And we'd do that using it as a counterpoint rhythm against the hi-hat and the shaker pattern, which were also counterpoint. So we'd have 3 different counterpoint rhythms happening, and that's what made it feel so dancey all the time. It made you want to like get up and move because you had all of these counterpoint rhythms happening that you may or may not have noticed, but they're in the synthesizers. So I think the EDM guys use this a lot now with sidechain. They sidechain the whole track now. Yeah, they get a little nuts. But we were doing it in the 80s. So, and actually we were doing things you couldn't, I mean, like if you tried to simulate that by writing a level or like writing automation to do it, you couldn't do it because it happened so quickly that it can follow a very complex rhythm pattern that isn't even in the song. It's just the pattern of the synthesizer is bubbling. So to program that or try to write that is nearly impossible without doing this. So that's a couple uses of side chaining. Serial compression. That's daisy chaining one compressor to the next. As you saw, there's different types of compressors that sound a little different. You've got the soft knee, and you've got the hard knee, and you've got the fast, and you've got the slow, and you've got all these different architectures that actually make things sound different. So one of the things that I do all the time, almost on every vocal, and I started doing this when I ran into a dynamic vocalist. She can sing quiet and loud like nobody's business. I mean, she's so powerful that I was constantly trying to adjust the levels so she wasn't distorting my tape machine. I was on tape back then. So I said, you know what? This is silly. I'm just going to use not one compressor. I'm going to use 2 compressors. So I took the output of one compressor and fed it into the output of the input of the second compressor. And the first compressor, I made a very soft knee, just gentle compression to start controlling the sound. And the second compressor, I adjusted the ratio so that it was very high, so that it acted more like a limiter, and so it really controlled the sound. So if anything got past the first compressor, the second compressor would really kick in and make it stop getting louder. And I was able to adjust it so it didn't sound like it was being compressed. It was very gentle, but it sounded like she had dynamics, but it didn't sound overbearing. So at one point I started using 3 in a row, 1, 2, and 3, because she was so dynamic that if you do a little bit of compression with each one of them, it sounds less compressed than if you try to do all that compression with one compressor. So if I don't want to hear the compression sound, but I want to control dynamics, I'll daisy chain them in a serial fashion like that. Parallel compression is another type of compression that I like quite a bit. And parallel compression, they sometimes call it New York compression. I don't know why they call it New York, other than maybe someone in New York used it once. No, seriously. Parallel compression is where you take a sound and you don't compress it directly. You send it off of an auxiliary, like, say, an insert, to a compressor and bring the compressed sound back into a fader to blend it back with the non-compressed sound. So you've got 2 signals. One is not compressed and one is compressed, and you add them together. So you don't compress the sound, you add the compressed sound to the original sound. What that does is it allows the drums to still sound dynamic and live without sounding compressed, but the compression sound is a really nice sound because it makes you think that things are louder in a psychoacoustic way, because that's what your ears would do. If it was loud, they'd compress. So when you hear the compressed sound, your brain thinks it's loud. So it makes it sound like it's really slamming, but still has a lot of dynamics to it. So that's a different use of compression. And then last but not least on the list, the ever-famous multiband compressors. Multiband compressors are the type of compressors that compress different bands of frequencies differently. The most famous version of that is called a de-esser, which I alluded to earlier, where instead of this situation where you take this third input and you trigger it from an external source, like sidechaining would, you take the same signal that's coming in and you pass it through a high-pass filter, and it's at a specific frequency that's high enough so only the high frequencies get through. So when a vocalist is singing, for example, and I've got a lot of S on my voice, or, the S sound, right? If it gets too aggressive, it can sometimes overtake the whole vocalist sound. So what you do is you put it through a de-esser. You take the signal and you pass it through a filter that only allows the S's to come out, and then you feed it into the side chain. So every time that those S's really pop out, the side chain tells the compressor, pull the level down. So when the S comes out too much, the compressor goes shh, and it really shuts down the sibilants, or the super high frequencies. That's a de-esser. Same principle can be used for all different types of frequencies. If I didn't have a high-pass filter there, let's say I had a bandpass filter there, and I only was filtering, only letting through the frequencies from 1 kilohertz to 4 kilohertz. Then those harsh frequencies that are in certain sounds, like that snare drum you're trying to fix, that has that ping at 2K, that's really irritating you, taking over the entire track, you can go ahead and use a multi-band compressor to take that one frequency band, and every time that frequency pops out too much, it pulls it down. So you can do the same thing on all different sounds, like your bass and your kick drum. If you want to remove some of the low frequencies in the bass, but not really lower the level of the bass, you can use a band type multi-band compressor to only do the low frequencies. These are used not primarily, they're used all over the place, but almost every time you master, you use a multi-band compressor, because a multi-band compressor can reshape the frequency content of your sound. So if I get a mix that has too much bottom end, I can put it through a multi-band compressor, and every time it gets too boomy, it'll reduce it. Or if it gets too harsh in the middle frequencies, I can reduce it. Or if it gets too sibilant, I can reduce it. And I can reshape the sound to the way that I want it to sound. And then after that, I'll throw an EQ on it to just sort of tweak it a little bit. So my compressor is more like the shotgun approach, where I'm going to be able to really reshape my sound and make it better. And then the EQ at the end is sort of like the very targeted frequencies that I want to get.